group because we have two excellent panelists. So let me just say a couple words about our panelists, and then we'll move on to their talks, and then we'll have time for question and answer. Our two panelists, one is Dr. Richard Fitton. He is a reader in energy performance of buildings at the University of Salford. If you don't know where the University of Salford is, I looked it up. It's actually near Manchester, England, which is the home of the best professional soccer in the world right now, if you're curious. And I will avoid getting off on that tangent because I'm sure we could talk forever about that. Richard is, he holds a PhD in building physics and is a chartered building surveyor. He's an expert on energy efficiency, particularly in buildings, and he is the technical lead for Salford's new Energy House 2 project, which I'm sure we'll hear about in his talk. Our other panelist is Dr. Barry Ray. Barry is the Ira and Nikki Harris Family Professor at Gerald Ford School of Public Policy at University of Michigan. Barry is an expert in environmental and energy policy. He is the author or co-author of 6 different books. He is a senior fellow at Brookings Institution, as well as a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. And Barry has been a friend of mine and a collaborator for the last 25 years. So there are all kinds of possibilities for tangents there too that I will avoid in the interest of time. And I will let our speakers get started talking. The way this is going to work is each of our speakers will have about 8 minutes to talk about their work and whatever they want to talk about. And then we'll turn to Q&A. I will just ask everybody to make sure that you're muted, other than the speakers, of course, but and also to use the chat function for questions. And as soon as Richard and Barry finish with their comments, I'll get started by asking a couple questions, and then we'll go to the chat room for more questions. So Richard, do you want to start?
Yeah, I was Barry was first, but if you don't mind, just give me 1 second to set up my slides, and we will crack on.
And if you need a moment, Richard, we can go to Barry first. I was just going out.
Yeah, why not? Because Zoom's asking me some kind of security questions with Apple, so I give you.
Okay, good luck with that. Good luck with that, Barry. Barry, I'll turn it over to you.
So I am slide free. Unlike Richard, I live near Detroit, which is the lowest performing National Football League franchise in the history of the National Football League, but that's another story for another time. Thank you, Bill, and to the organizers for this event. The issue of decarbonization and utilities is so important and yet so challenging. To convert established fossil fuel-based systems, move them toward cleaner renewable sources, and do it at a point where in the transportation sector, we are anticipating a dramatic transition to electricity, which will increase the demand for even more electricity than we're producing now, is truly challenging to think about. And I really welcome this conversation and comparison between the UK and the Midwest. And partly, and I say this as a native Midwesterner, my regret that the progress in the Midwest over the last 10 or 15 years has been so much slower on these issues than we have seen in the UK. And I do wonder how we might think about partnerships, lessons, and all the rest. A few illustrations. It's striking to me that we've been having a very fruitful conversation about climate policy for over an hour now. No one has used the P word of pricing, carbon tax or some kind of a price on carbon, which has just long been thought in policy circles, certainly in economics, but around the world as a linchpin to kind of drive changes, shifts. The UK system, whether it has been historically linked through the European Union or independently, has combined a tax or levy system, which has been sustained, as well as an emissions trading system, which even post-Brexit is going to be sustained with some links to the European Union, as I understand it. And yet in the US, we look at a situation where even at this moment of strong interest in climate policy with our current federal government, our new president, carbon pricing seems remote, off the table. And how do we think about those partnerships or comparisons and relationships? And can we truly move toward far-reaching decarbonization in the US or in the Midwest, without any seeming appetite for a carbon price, particularly when none of the states in the Midwest have adopted or tried to sustain any variation or version of a tax over the last 20 years or so. So I think that's really challenging. A final note there, would only note that the US Trade Representative just yesterday issued a 300-page report, kind of a Biden era take on trade policy. And there is a fascinating section in there about a border carbon price adjustment. The idea that the US would actually impose a tax on imported goods from other countries, even though we don't have a price and aren't planning to develop this. So this is an interesting one to weigh and think about, and how we move the Midwest, which has had struggles in this area, without a price. We've also seen in the US over the last 7 or 8 years in particular, challenges with unilateral executive action. I was intrigued 5 or 6 years ago to watch the Obama administration embrace the Clean Power Plan, trying to decarbonize the electricity sector through the powers of the Clean Air Act, where, Bill, you are the resident expert and have still written probably the definitive book on the evolution of the Clean Air Act, Dimensions of Federalism, which everyone ought to take a look at and think about how we use that tool. Years have passed, a number of Midwestern states actively engaged in opposition, in some cases joining litigation to prevent the Obama administration from using the powers of the Clean Air Act and the utility sector in this way, a plan that was designed to work collaboratively with states. And so we've seen real challenges at the federal level, but also, frankly, some really uneven performance within individual states, whether that's Missouri, where you are today, Bill, in my own case in Michigan, where many of these individual states have passed some version of a portfolio standard, moved initially in these directions. It was mentioned by Kyle earlier. We've seen in cases like Kansas and Iowa, substantial expansion of renewable energy for a whole bunch of reasons that largely have nothing to do with climate policy or climate concern in those jurisdictions. And I think with this, especially if we look at the current tensions and partisan divides in state governments, including the one in the state where I live, where one governor and a legislature are really at loggerheads on all of these kinds of issues. Credibly thinking about a path forward by one or more Midwestern states, again, in the absence of a federal carbon price and federal pressure, although that may be shifting and changing in some ways that we can also discuss, are going to move in these areas, are going to be challenging. And here I would also just note a couple of issues that we've really seen that have emerged as big concerns. One is the equity or environmental justice considerations when one engages substantial transition toward renewables. Where does that siting occur? How are the monies concentrated? How do we think about these revenues? Both the UK and the Midwest have invested heavily in gas infrastructure. How do we think about that from an environmental justice or equity perspective? And then there's this huge issue of siting. Siting of turbines is relatively easy in remote corners of Kansas and Iowa. But when we begin to think then about transmission, the massive need for land use areas to produce wind and solar, certainly at the pace that we have been seeing in recent years emerge in the UK, those are going to be challenging. And even here in Michigan, where there was widely assumed that communities would just open their arms and accept solar farms and wind turbines, it has been extremely contentious in many parts of the state. We actually have local governments in Michigan that have banned any production or made it very hard for wind and solar to come in. And in many cases, these are the jurisdictions in our state that are the most concerned about climate change, that they have these issues. So these are going to be big issues and challenges. And I do think there are some just great opportunities here to learn from what some of our colleagues elsewhere have been doing, including the European Union, including, in my case, right over the border in Canada, which is a fundamentally different world of climate and energy policy development. I'm 25 minutes away from the Canadian border. And if I could get over the bridge this morning, I would be in a very different arena in terms of moving on renewables for a whole bunch of policy reasons. And I do think, I'm so glad to hear this emphasis of universities, innovations and the like. We have been struggling in Ann Arbor for a long time, but have actually just developed through a 2-year planning process that I had the privilege of participating in, move to an internal university carbon tax, significant engagement in renewables development and the like. And I really do think, and I very much welcome comments on this that were raised earlier, the ability of universities not just to clean up their own nests, but to harness this power and move into their state capitals and move collectively, especially with clean energy leaning cities, is a real opportunity, and one that, at least in my case, I'm hoping to see a lot more of in the years ahead. So those are a few initial thoughts, and I'm really happy to hand things back to my colleagues.
Thanks very much, Barry. And I appreciate the shout out for my book. It's that's very kind of you. Anyway, Richard, are you set up to go now?
Hopefully.
Oh, it's all yours.
It says host disabled participant screen sharing now. I don't know if that's anything on your side or my side. I'll try again. That's all it's saying. Host is disabled participant screen sharing.
Beth, do you know what's going on there?
I don't, so I apologize for technical difficulties. Richard, I just sent you an email. Email me because I can share my screen. So if you
Yep,
can
if I
send it
send you
to
my
me-
slides.
Yes,
Yep.
just send it to me real quick and I will share my screen.
Okay, not a problem.
Many apologies. As a host, I thought I should be able to give you that ability and I can't.
I'm going to send it you over as a PDF. It's probably easiest.
Ooh, somebody, thank you. Somebody just said, go to security and allow. This is crowdsourcing Zoom.
Is that me or is that you, Beth, to go to security and allow?
No, that's,
The host should be able to do it by going down to those bottom tabs. It will either, I don't believe you can do it under participants, but you should have a security section in those tabs at the bottom, and then it'll say something like allow participants screen share.
Well, I wish I had it, Beth. I don't see it.
okay. Nope, I'm looking. Richard, let's see. I've got you up top more.
Barry, while they're working on that, I wondered if maybe we could say a little more about, I loved your comments about the chance to learn from other jurisdictions. And I know you've done a lot of work in Canada. And maybe you could update us a little bit on where the Canadians are these days in terms of their NDCs and their efforts.
Sure, happy to. And a few thoughts there. Much like the US, Canada is a very decentralized federal system. And if anything, gives more power to individual provinces in their energy policy than does the United States, which is pretty unique. The Canadians have struggled, and there are some provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, that produce lots of oil and gas. And this is actually funneled into the transfer payment system. So less affluent jurisdictions across Canada get transfer money from those revenues each year. It's baked into the fiscal system of the country. So this has been a long struggle in Canada, but about 4 or 5 years ago, the current Liberal Party government, headed by Justin Trudeau, endorsed a carbon price, which would be set up nationally, in some cases building on some early examples, not dissimilar to what we have not in the Midwest, but on the respective coasts of our country where we do have pricing regimes in place, and gave provinces a chance to move toward $30 and then $50 a ton by 2025. The Trudeau government has now proposed more than doubling that price to over $120 Canadian by the end of this decade. And it's seen as a primary way, but not the only way, that they'll move toward reaching some of their decarbonization and then the Paris goals. So it's been a very kind of interesting method and mechanism. I do know in our neighboring province of Ontario, which is the most populous province, thinks of itself as actually part of the Midwest in many respects. They have had a very active build-out program through feed-in tariffs and other mechanisms, particularly for wind, and have reached a fairly high level of renewables penetration. Although even there has been a fair amount of siting backlash, and particularly in more rural and more remote areas. But again, you cross into Canada, and you really feel like you're in a different kind of energy regime, in part for some of those very reasons, Bill.
That's great. Thank you. Very helpful. How are we doing, Richard? I don't want to cut your time short either.
so we're doing two things. One, he's leaving to be made co-host, but at the same time he did that, his presentation popped up in my email. So between one of the two, we will have it available. And I appreciate everybody sharing ideas. I found that every once in a while in Zoom, something happens and you just get a bit stuck.
Yeah. Nothing quite like the cat in the courtroom and whatever that scene was that we all saw on Zoom about a week ago, but there are always technical issues. So thanks for trying to work through them.
This was what I was afraid of. Many apologies all. I was very nervous last night that something was going to go wrong in the technical part of it.
Well, that's okay, Beth. I know you're working on it, and I know Richard is too. So we can just keep talking here for a while. Barry, I love you know me, I love the topic of carbon pricing. I just think it's incredibly important, and I'm really glad you brought it up in your comments. And Richard may want to comment on it as well. Do you want to say something more about that in terms of just how difficult, you mentioned that the difficulty of adopting it in the US, and can you talk about some places where they have been able to adapt it? And maybe not even just the US, but I've always been intrigued by British Columbia and how they have the carbon tax there and how they actually got that through. It's not exactly a liberal hotbed, and yet they've had this carbon tax for years. And maybe
I think that's right, Bill, and that's actually been a cornerstone, a model of what the federal government is doing. It's a classic policy diffusion issue, which we've been talking about for years, how the innovations in one state or region of the country can be influential. Here, I would argue one model to think about in the US is in the American Northeast. There are now 11 states known under the auspices of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that for a number of years now have imposed in the electricity sector, along with a number of other policies, have set up a price through an auction mechanism to secure allowances to be able to use fossil fuels to some extent in the sector that imposes a price that's relatively low. But interestingly, that money is then returned to each of the states, and most of them use that to either provide rebates on electricity bills or fund varying kinds of transitions. So there is no foolproof system here, but it is interesting to see how some states have moved. And here I would only note that, I'll hold back because it looks like Richard's ready to go.
Thanks, Barry. Appreciate jumping in. Richard,
okay. We got there. Can everyone see and hear me and see the slides more importantly?
Yes, you're good.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sorry about that. Technical glitches as always, but we got there in the end. I'm Richard. I work at the University of Salford, which, as Bill has mentioned, is Manchester in the UK, just northwest of the UK. We are a research group, been going for about 10 years, and we look at the other kind of end of all this. So we look at everything at the other side of the grid. So we look at everything on the consumer side of the meter. So really look at buildings and the transition towards decarbonisation of buildings, but obviously the utilities hang the building off the end. So we can't think about one without thinking about the other. So we have 4 labs. We have Energy House, Thermal Measurement Laboratory, Smart Meters Lab, and the new facility, which is Energy House 2, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So I'll just try and catch up some time here. So I'll whiz through kind of what we do. We really look at a few different strands of energy. We look at how the house or the home can perform. So we have an existing facility called the Energy House. We look at how we turn an older building, so a kind of solid wall, a red brick building, into something that's very much more efficient than that. And we talk about putting new controls, EV, smart controls, and linking all the different parts of energy efficiency together with this new kind of brand of thing that's coming online now, which is this whole idea of the decarbonised grid and how we can do things like that. We do a lot of field trialing and a lot of commercial work as well. Thermal Measurement Laboratory, we look at how insulation performs under controlled conditions. And we have the Smart Meter and Smart Grid Lab, which looks very much at the linkage between smart meters, IoT, and things like appliance disaggregation and how we make sense of what goes on in a building just using smart meter and smart home data. That's one of our newest labs. So what we really do, it all centers around this building here that we see with the orange door on the front. This is Energy House. It was opened in 2011. We generated quite a lot of research income, so about 1.5 million of pure research income plus commercial testing as well. We look at how we improve that building. insulation, air tightness, smart heating, smart controls, and more recently, the last 5 years, the linkage between the clean and the smart grid coming online as well. Linked obviously with EV charging and V2G and V2H and things like this. So we also do a lot of testing of other people's tests. So if someone has a methodology to validate the energy performance of a building, what greater place to do it than something that's under very controlled conditions like this building is. And I'll show you how we control those conditions in a second. And we do lots of large scale field trials for the government, and we do a lot of commercial testing of different energy savings devices. So we work with some bigger companies, Weissman, Danfoss. The UK government is a big client of ours. Saint-Gobain, the world's largest construction product manufacturer, Calf Insulation, Honda, Hive, smart controls, people like this. Oops. So, sorry, jump to slide. So how we do it is we control the climate. So we take a building that's a 1900s, 1910 solid red brick building, no cavity, no insulation in there, but represents about 23% of the UK housing stock. And so I'm a physicist, so we take a purely physics approach and we control the environment. So we can put -10 to +30 degrees Celsius, wind, rain, solar radiation, and snow on the building. That's illustrated quite well by some snow and some icicles on that picture. But what it lets us do is either keep a perfectly flat line or create diurnal profiles, so day and night cycles. And we can run a whole season in a few days. So a whole year in about a month. So when you compare that to what you can do out in the field, it's quite extraordinary. So there's only one that I know of in the world that represents this type of house and this type of chamber. So this is the characteristics of that house. Totally uninsulated, single glaze, suspended timber floors, the old kind of style lath and plaster ceilings, a pitch roof, and clearly with all this Raymond at the energy retrofit market. And it's stood us in really good stead for the last 10 working years that we've been working on that. Still, that's booked up that building for the next year and a half in terms of just looking at retrofit solutions for the UK market. It's so important in the UK now that we get these old buildings up to some kind of standard. If up to a quarter of your building stock is like this, then it's a significant problem, and one that we shouldn't be afraid to address. My slides are going a bit crazy now. It's not good. There we go. So why do we do all this? So we look really at several problems: energy efficiency, energy pathology. So energy pathology is when something doesn't quite go right with an energy efficiency measure. How do we fix when it doesn't work as we want it to work? Smart energy systems is really key now in the UK, and it's as key in the USA as well. Because I've done my reading over the years. Electrification of heat and transport and fuel poverty is a real important driver. When people can't afford to heat their homes, do they heat or do they eat? That's the question that needs to be asked a lot of times when we're talking to all this. And rapid demonstrators. We can demonstrate something really quick and prototype things really quick. So the few live projects that we got on the books at the moment, we got a 300 home field trial looking at smart controls, so smart radiator valves, 100 home field trials looking at how we connect EVs, batteries and PV together in typical retrofits. We got a huge retrofit project going on at the moment in Energy House 1, sponsored by the government. That's looking at every type of insulation that we can put onto that building. And then we put it on piece by piece and we disaggregate the savings. And that's what we find people are really interested in at the moment. If I do X to a building or Y to a building, how do I make my savings? Which is the best measure? Which is the best? I'll use a USAism, which is the best bang for buck. Okay, that's what people are really interested in at the moment. And a large scale review of EPS insulation as well, and how it degrades along its lifespan. So this is a typical project that we did. So we were working with Honda and an energy provider on this. So this is how we link all kinds of different things into a very simple house and have all these multiple assets under control. So at the bottom here, we have a smart hot water tank that aligns with the time of use tariff. So when things change and the price signals change on the grid, How do we sink energy into that? We've got the Tesla battery here. Tesla, very good, but quite difficult to work with, and to integrate the systems is no more easier. Honda provided the vehicle to grid and the vehicle to home system, and all this is linked through an air source heat pump as well to inject heat into the building. So it really kind of, you would think that was quite a straightforward piece, incredibly difficult to actually get everything working. And it took us about 4 months and 3 researchers to get that system all working and to validate what that system could do. Another example of what we do in Energy House 1 is we put a load of things on the building. So we build up a full retrofit, and then we take things off piece by piece. So we're talking floor insulation, solid wall insulation, high performance glazing, loft insulation, and we also did some acoustic testing in there as well to see what the difference was. And this is the thing that people are interested in most. It's what contributes to the reduction in carbon and the reduction in energy. And this is where we start to build up a good idea of when we've got a house type like X or Y, what we should do first, second, and third. And when we come to looking at decarbonisation, this is really the work that needs doing, because the new houses, we can decarbonise new houses, we can change the regulation to suit, we can ask for nearly zero or zero, or even kind of energy positive buildings. But when we get this type of building, we find that small changes might do small things, and you need to do something big. So the really big saving on that building, 72%, is you externally insulate the walls. It's as simple as that. It's very expensive. And then we need to start to think about how we finance these things as well. So we reduced the entire heating load of that building by 63%, but that retrofit stood about £14,000. It's incredibly expensive. So I'm going to whistle through this video and I'm going to talk over the top of it, but this is the new research piece that we're getting together now. So this is being built at the moment. It's a £16 million facility just over the road from where Energy House 1 is. We needed to make a pivotal step. We were really kind of having people biting at our heels, and there was some people doing it in South Korea. Some people mentioned doing something similar to Energy House 1 in Australia. So we thought we can either just carry on making little bits, or we do something different. So we went for the big one, and we tried to get a significant pot of money in, which we did. So this is Energy House 2. I'll skip some little bits so you can see it, but this is basically the shape and size of it. It's a huge, big black box. Like I said, built on the campus. It's I think it's unsurpassed in terms of scale of building physics work. You get an idea how big it is by the trucks you see parked outside of the back. 1,050 meters square with 2 large chambers in it. Okay, so if you imagine the Energy House 1 had that Victorian terrace in it, this is approximately 6 times or 7 times bigger than that facility. It will be constructed by December this year and will be opening in March next year. So in a minute, the top will come off the building and you'll see the shape and size of it. So these are full scale, real houses, new build houses. So there'll be 4 buildings in total, 2 in each chamber. So we can experiment on 4 buildings simultaneously, whether that's an existing type of building, a new building, a building from China, a building from the States, a building from Russia. We're not fussed. Whatever we can get in through those cargo doors at the back, we will build. We've already filled the building for its first kind of series of test slots. It varies from Energy House 1. The HVAC is a lot deeper, so -20 to +40. More wind, more rain, more snow, more solar radiation, and clearly a bigger building area in there as well. The problem that we can't do with Energy House 1 is we can't make significant changes in there. We can't knock the building down and start again. So the climate that we got in there covers 95% of the global population. So not the land mass, the population. You know, Antarctica is not in our remit yet, maybe one day. Deeper climatic conditions, like I said, more wind, more rain, more snow. But this whole advantage of it to open the doors at the back, come in and build whatever you wish in there. Okay, that's really the cut and thrust of that building. We also realize that wind and rain does have a significant effect on the actual building performance. So all the climatic conditions that come with an individual building can be assigned to it. So we can look at how a house performs in China, then we can move it to Norway. And then we can see what the difference is in that building performance. Will it work all around the world? So a lot of off-site manufacturers now want a building to work everywhere. It's flexible. We've been asked by many EV companies, people who want to test military tanks, people who want to test caravans, SUVs, all these types of things that now people are obsessed with the energy consumption of things that are being heated and cooled. So that's really the main point of Energy House 2. So where we're currently at with that, so that's just a couple of diagrams. That's where we're up to. So the rest of the frame is actually now up. I took that last month. So you'll see the shape and size of the building. It's the foundations you can see going in. So you build it inside this pit. So the foundation is in the cooled soil as well, or heated soil. So we needed to make a massive pivot. So we needed to make additional offerings, and we need to put new buildings, international marketplace. Offsite construction, we think, is going to take the rest of the market. We see a limited lifespan now for two things. For gas heating, it's gone. And we think the brick and masonry has gone as well. We think offsite, it will now be the thing that takes over. So these are the climatic conditions which are discussed. They're the foundations. So we have an obsession with heat loss through ground slabs that it's never measured, it's never modeled properly. And that's something we have a massive intention to do in that next test facility. So the heat flux sensors are already in that slab. I put them in the other day under the concrete so we can see exactly kind of what's going on. So new houses, small commercial units, so shops and small schools can be tested in there as well, or parts of the hospital wing we've been looking at recently. So buildings can be built and improved and replaced. And that's the whole idea. 6 months, you finish your building, you knock it down, and you can either take it with you or we put a new one in its place. And we can't do that with Energy House 1. And we also, you'll have noticed in the video that the buildings all have cars next to them. So I'm a big believer in the EV. I drive an EV, or lots of my colleagues do, and peers. And the whole idea of shifting energy from the car to the home and home to the car is something that we think is going to be part of the housing improvement, shall we say, in the UK and globally. This whole idea of being able to charge at work or charge at a cheap time and then come and dump it back into the house is a very appealing thing for as consumers kind of get to grips with that. It's still in its infancy at the moment, but V2G we think is going to be a really, really big and powerful leap forward. And that's it, Bill. So I tried to kind of wheel through that because we're running short of time, weren't we? So there we go.
Fascinating. That really is fascinating, Richard. Thanks for showing that. Your graphics are excellent too. That's really kind of cool. And I'm sure there's lots of questions about this. I guess you're obviously a physicist. Barry and I are both political scientists, so we're probably both wondering the same thing. And what are the politics of getting this thing going? I mean, is it easier to do something like this because energy efficiency is more of a win-win, and thus
if I tell you this, Bill, this will probably answer your question. I designed that building on the back of a kind of notepad, and that was 5 years ago. So it took us 5 years to get from, no, actually 6 if you include this year. It took us 6 years from me doing a sketch to us where we are now with the frame coming up. The funding was from 2 places, well, 3 actually. One part was the university. They believe in what we do. The other part was the ERDF, the European Regional Development Fund. So we've now left Europe. We took the last slice of money out of Europe, if you like, that we could. And the other part of the money was from the Office for Students, which looks at how we develop on-campus learning and increase our kind of appeal to students as well on campus. So it's a threefold kind of funding approach. Now, there is a commercial aspect to all this. We can charge, to use that. So Energy House 1 is £2,500 a day in pounds. That will probably be something similar for each house. So there is a commercial revenue stream. There's obviously academic grants, which pays for a lot of our work as well. So we have this quite a nice approach where we can use commercial funding to do research and then publish independently. So it's a nice, that's for an academic, that's a nice to have. We get paid to write papers in essence.
That's fantastic. That's really cool. And I did see one question that's on the chat board from Michael Weissession about whether or not you guys use energy psychology. In other words, the idea that people When
Yes.
people are doing you do. Okay, go.
So what I mean, I'm not a psychologist. We as we say, we have people that do that. But what I would say is Energy House 1 was designed in such a way that it was nice and it was realistic to the building type that it was there for. We couldn't have people live in it. These next buildings can have people live in the buildings. So it's fully kind of done to regulations and everything else. So we can have people that go in there, they can drive a car in at night if they wish as well. And they can kind of get to grips with the whole idea of the thermal comfort, the control systems. We can maybe ask them to pay the bills and things like that. So people can get this idea of living in there as well. Now, the Hawthorne effect is well studied, you know, and people don't behave the same as if they're being observed, but we think that's a big step forward. So yeah, we do have some behavioral insight, shall we say, into what goes on in those homes.
Can I ask you to try and tie into what Barry Rabe was saying earlier about carbon pricing and how that can be a motivation for people to be more energy efficient in their homes?
Yeah, so we work, the main kind of smart grid sponsor for that project is a firm called Octopus Energy. Now they're making big waves and they've actually just moved into the States as well, Octopus. So they're a big innovator in the UK. What they innovate around is time of use tariffs. So that they aim to kind of clean the grid, if you like, by splitting into 48 chunks, half an hour chunks, and then selling those at different prices during the day. Now, obviously, that has an impact on carbon and sometimes cheaper carbon periods and the cheaper cost periods as well. So that's time of use tariff. There's another company that we do some work with as well called OVO, and they use this approach. It's very recent to the market, called type of use tariff. So by looking at your smart meter readings and disaggregating it, they can see when you're charging your vehicle, for instance, or using a heat pump as another example. And they will charge you a different tariff for the different things that you're doing, which I think is really interesting. So that's type of use tariff. So yeah, and load shifting is clearly a big part of what we do as well. You know, dumping power into a battery or an EV at given times in the day we think is a big move forward.
That is fascinating. Barry, can you pick up on that and talk about efforts to do things like that in the American states that have maybe there? I've seen a couple of comments on the chat room about going back to your point about the states being very inconsistent in their support of renewable energy. And it seems to me that the use of these kinds of things that Richard's talking about are ways that we could get people to be more attuned to or more willing to use green energy.
And I think it's a very fair point. I think Richard makes, you know, a great illustration through this important work that he's been doing. I do think alongside the challenges politically of operationalizing a move to more renewables is how to really think about how you systematize energy efficiency advantages, particularly because of often the very, very high capital cost to get that initial gain and who is going to pay for that, whether that's an individual homeowner or anyone else. I think one of the biggest surprises for me in going through this 2-year exercise at the University of Michigan, which is not the biggest Big Ten school by any means, is to realize that to change our core system of heating to go geothermal would be 3.5 billion with a B dollars. And then you begin to throw in energy efficiency, top code issues. You begin to look at numbers that completely would marginalize all other expenditures of the University of Michigan. We can take loans. We're always open to have donors come in and write checks, although we've never had it. No one's offered us $3 billion at one pop. How does one put that into policy terms? And I think politically there's a real challenge here because and I'm curious of your thoughts on this, Richard, too. Politically, we think of very immediate near-term benefits. Am I going to get reelected? But am I also going to pay raise this year? That kind of thing. To forestall that and push that off longer term and make those big investments now in energy efficiency or renewables or transmission lines. I see there's a really interesting question in the chat room. Take a lot of investment up front for which there's benefit later on, but that's really, really hard to do, I think, in any political system, whether it's a university or Europe or the United States.
Absolutely, and one of the problems we had in the UK was this aging housing stock. So because we have this aging housing stock, that the oldest and the least efficient in the entirety of Europe the UK housing stock is. There's also a risk. So when you start, so there's a financial risk, which clearly, the £1 billion, £3 billion of campus is clearly not, you'd have to press some significant buttons to achieve that level of funding, and you've got to weigh up whether it's worth it in any terms. But I think what the UK government were really concerned about is when you start to wrap things in insulation, particularly older buildings, there's this technological risk, and things failed a lot when we started to do this. So there was real big problems with condensation, and they were making a bad building worse, and that was the big problem. And it's so before they even got to this funding mechanism, which I think we're probably on the precipice of doing something in the UK with funding. I think we might have done something if it wasn't for COVID. They had to go through this big kind of piece of research about how do we treat these buildings carefully and not make them a whole lot worse, than they currently are in terms of building, in terms of internal air quality and things like this. So there was that risk that came into it as well. So I think you're right that the policymakers would like an instant hit on this, but it's such a complex issue to address. And a university campus, dare I say, is a complex beast, but nowhere near as much as kind of 26 million homes. And when you're gonna look at that scale and understand that there's this huge risk, this technical risk, I think government feel very uneasy about that. No matter what colour of party that they look at, I think that there's a lot of unease. I think if it was a simple thing, that they would have done it by now, because it would have won a lot of votes. And I don't know what the answer is. But when you talk about a campus and £3.5 billion, it's not surprising, but it's a problem that is very difficult to solve in my opinion. But I think that the way to solve it may be incrementally, but you can't look at putting things like an air source heat pump or something like that in an inefficient building. It just doesn't work. It doesn't get you anywhere near the performance that they claim to get. So your savings evaporate away. So the incremental's a nice type of approach, but it doesn't answer a lot of the questions. It's a wicked problem, as they say, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. That's a great exchange by you guys.
Typical academic there. I didn't answer the question.
No. It's these questions are hard to answer, and in fact, I see another one on the chat that just popped up about to what extent will a carbon fee and dividend fund the energy transition? Barry, do you want to take that?
I don't want to suggest that any kind of a carbon tax or fee is a silver bullet or the only answer. And clearly, the specific question of a dividend raises if you can actually work through the political system to impose the price, which moves a number of significant things, as you're suggesting, Richard. Then the question does become how you use that revenue. In a dividend approach, you basically give the money back, which is a very interesting strategy. I do think the trend around the world, and I'm not sure about the British component, but I know this is where the EU is going with their trading scheme and the Green Deal, is that more and more of that funding is being put directly into transition toward green, alternative energy efficiency, you name it. And so if we look at that system in the US Northeast called RGGI, it's essentially that kind of mechanism. The money goes back to individual states in the Northeast. It's actually including Virginia now, which is formerly a big coal state. And most of the money is put into transitional considerations and concerns that are unique to that state. That can involve including some of the very sorts of retrofits and things that you're talking about, Richard, in some of these Northeastern states. But it does begin to play out, but it's all contingent once you impose the fee, how you decide to allocate that money. And that's not an easy one to think through or to wrestle with, because lots of ideas emerge in terms of how you got to spend money.
That's a good answer. So in the meantime, while you guys are both talking long term, in the meantime, we continue to rely on a certain mix that includes fossil fuels. And I noticed, Richard, you could talk about this, that you all have moved away from coal significantly. You're still using quite a bit of natural gas. And I know the US is kind of now has moved towards natural gas. And maybe you both could comment on the use of natural gas as what some people refer to as a cleaner energy source, and how the Richard, maybe you can talk about how the Brits moved away from coal as much as they have.
Yeah, so we have moved away from coal. I think it's safe to say that coal is no longer a significant part of our domestic mix in terms of coal fires. I had a coal fire in my house when I was a youngster, but I think that's very quickly evaporating away. Natural gas, as you put it, is disliked in the UK at the moment. We don't see it as, it's a fossil fuel after all. There will be no new installations of natural gas after 2025. It's gone. And that's why I wrestled with Energy House 2. Do we put natural gas supplies in? Yes, we did, but only just. And that was to do the comparison between the two. So we are really coming away from natural gas. Air source will take a great deal of that burden for the new builds, but let's not fool ourselves here. We build a tiny amount of new builds in the UK compared to our housing stock of 20 odd million. We might build 20, 30, 40, 50,000. So it's not, our replacement is very, very low in terms of how we replace our buildings. So yes, we will come off natural gas for our new installs, but we are really stuck with it for the next 20 or 30 years. There's a drive towards air source heat pumps. There's also a huge drive in research terms towards hydrogen. So hydrogen's got two strands to it. Either we pump it straight into the mains as pure hydrogen, which involves a lot of changing, or we take a blend approach. So the blend approach is looking at putting around a 12% blend of hydrogen into the gas main to basically kind of take away some of that carbon. But how do we generate the hydrogen is the question then. So again, I think we're doing lots of thinking about it, and the USA is doing the same. But have we got a kind of fixed approach forward yet? No. But I can safely say that 2025 we kill new gas.
Okay, Barry, are you?
And Richard, thank you. You know, there are some real parallels in our respective cases because of the growing US reliance on gas and marginalization of coal, and yet there has not yet been those sets of discussions in the US for the most part. And one of the concerns that I have is that over the last 15 years, the US has become one of the world's largest natural gas producers. The presumption of transitioning from coal to gas as a bridge fuel or whatever you want to call it was predicated on the assumption that methane emissions were pretty close to zero, or at least 1%. We know empirically from study after study after study that methane, which if released into the atmosphere, has more than 25 times the same global warming potential of carbon for its first century in the atmosphere. We know those numbers are just much, much higher, being produced everywhere in the US and for the most part around the world. It's an American tragedy in my view in many respects. The only government in the country that has really begun to look at this seriously, and I'm glad Robert mentioned something else about Colorado in the chat, is the state of Colorado, but our other natural gas producing states just turn the other way because there's so much more money to be made from oil. And I tend to think that that becomes a really interesting pressure point, especially for those countries, possibly the European Union, that is going to be buying a lot more liquefied natural gas from the US, possibly competing with Russia. How we think about price and bring down the methane issue. And for me, this is a real tipping point that underscores the need to, Richard, do some of the very things that you're talking about in the US, and that is really squeezed much harder than we've been willing to on that natural gas side, including the installation issues that you mentioned, which is spot